And now over to John, writing your way out of a crisis. Unmute yourself.
You sure that's a good idea? It might be better that I stay muted. Perhaps you can tell me afterwards, and in that case I'll learn for next time. But thank you, Tali, for asking me to speak at the opening memory talk in memory of Dr. Joseph Berke. Unfortunately, I never had the privilege of meeting. I've been thinking about the heading of creativity, spirituality, and well-being. And I have to say, in my life, there was no obvious early link between them, as there was no early acumen that I'm aware of wanting to be able to write. All this came much later on. In order to work out how these changes happen, I have to go back 30 years and a couple of trauma that I was ill-equipped to deal with. One was a personal bereavement, the other was a commercial one, a loss of job. And coming from or having the advantage of a charmed childhood, it left me ill-equipped to deal with any adversity. Nothing ever went wrong for so many, many years. And so when two of these things happen, it actually had a dramatic effect, although I didn't know quite then what that effect would be. There was a movement, I suppose, immediately afterwards of becoming more observant as a response to what happened. And I have to say, it was more of a perfunctory situation rather than one seeking for actual meaning, but it was obviously something had affected me. Perhaps even it was just asking, why me? Was I chosen to have gone through these two particular things? And it was a slow progression, but nevertheless, it was a departure from a secular past that brought a certain amount of new awareness. But it was the historic feeling of underachievement in my day job, which was in business for many years, that led me to try and see if there was anything else I could do. I'd always been interested in comedy, and I thought it was about time I tried to see whether I could actually put down some of the things that I'd found amusing and that other people might have found amusing too. And so therefore I committed myself to writing a quote for every day of the year. That was quite demanding. And I did. I wrote a quote for every day, 365 quotes. And then I did a female version because the male version was too much like me. And I wasn't too happy that the character that emerged was mine. So I did a much better female version. And I decided to see whether or not I could do anything with these quotes, and I turned them into a range of greetings cards. But the self-deprecating humor, certainly on the male side, didn't catch on particularly. But there was a start. There was something that I was able to do that I hadn't done before. And I was applying to my mind to a part that had never been used, and therefore there was something that was telling me I needed to continue. And I came up with an idea of another comedy. This time, it was a political comedy based upon a strange scenario. What if, and it was based upon the 2001 re-election in America, what happened in that recount in the 2001 election if one person was holding up the balance of power? What would happen? And I wrote a synopsis of this story, and it happened to catch the attention of a director who I was introduced to. And I said, well, what do you think we should do with this? He said, well, I think it actually would make a quite interesting stage play. I said, well, how do you do that? He said, well, I'll show you. The thing was, it was a paid apprenticeship in reverse. Many months later, learning how to write dialogue on the job, a first draft of this play called In the Balance was finished. And I said to him, well, now what do we do? He said, well, you're the producer. I said, I'm sorry. He said, you're the producer. You better find yourself a theatre and employ some actors. And I didn't realize at all that I would have to, that would be my responsibility, but there was no one else to do it. And so I did what was required, ended up hiring a theatre for 6 weeks, employing the actors, a 6-week run, and lost a lot of money in the process. But I have to say, I've never had so much fun losing money so quickly. I remember so many sleepless nights counting empty theatre seats. I thought this has got to be a better way than this. But I wasn't sufficiently put off not to try again. Next time round, I was a little cannier and decided if I was to lose less money, I'd better reduce the number of actors and halve the size of the run, which is what I did. It was reasonably successful. Wasn't capable of a transfer to the West End like the first one, but it gave me some encouragement that I should continue further. The only way I figured to lose no money at all was to have a monologue with me in the main part. But I didn't write one of those. But my mentor at that time had better things to do with his life. And therefore I was left alone knowing what the next stage should be. The spiritual path was making a slow progression as my writing at that stage, but nevertheless, it was there. My next stage was to find out whether I could write on my own. Very, very different situation to a collaborative process. And the whole idea was to knock out a couple of plays, see whether they're accepted, but I wasn't intending to produce them. In between that, I was introduced to a book publisher, but I'd never written a book and I didn't know quite what to do. One of the stories, Tali, as you mentioned, was a play about a gladiator who became a sage based on the life of Shimon Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. And for some unknown reason, this book publisher thought that was a great story and it should be adapted to a novel. But I'd never written a novel before. A play is a third of the size of a novel. And again, it was another process of learning to write on the job. I have to say, the first draft came back with more corrections than my worst piece of work at school. And how I continue not to throw in the towel is still beyond me. But I did. And eventually, it was deemed to be sufficiently okay to publish. And when the first books rolled off the press, it seemed to make all that work worthwhile. Other books followed with new representation here or abroad and everything else, but something else was happening at that particular time. It seemed that as more novels were written with a recurring theme of personal journeys, I'd realized was purely an attempt to come to terms with my own past through characters who unfortunately shared some of the same character traits as myself. That I realized was because I become obsessed about writing because there was so much to say. It was my therapy, although I haven't found a way yet to charge myself for the privilege. This brought another development as well, and that was the tools to work out problems on my own. When you're concocting a story with intricate plots and subplots and everything else, you can get yourself in a terrible tizzy. But there's no one to ask. And so you have to be able to solve certain things that otherwise you might pick up the phone in any other walk of life to someone, but work it out yourself because there is no one to ask. And I have to say that mechanism is the same mechanism I used years later in my spiritual learning. I wasn't prepared any longer to put aside those questions, big questions, of which there were no answers to. I was no longer prepared to abide by negative, I admit, predisposition, that because I had been able to come up with a palatable explanation for these things, it hindered my progress. I instead worked out myself that if there were things I didn't understand, put them on one side for the time being. And maybe I can come back to them with greater knowledge and be able to look at them in a different light. I suppose the ultimate proof that creativity and spirituality are now in tandem is a future novel being planned that mirrors my ongoing spiritual journey. I think that basically gives some short trajectory of how from a strange or a zero start of creativity, things arrived as that, and in terms of spirituality, where I am today. And the journey continues. And the journey will, I think, all being well, will continue in the writing of novel stories that reflect my ongoing journey through characters, through novels, through fiction, which is based upon lots of things that continue to happen to me.
Thank you very, very much.